I am Jane Nichols, Miss Jane from the Society of Wine Educators, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Adam Edmondson. Adam is actually an Eagle Scout, which is very impressive. He has degrees in philosophy and German, so if you're not scared of that, you should be. That's also very impressive. He actually is a marketing entrepreneur, which I find very impressive. So perhaps he can answer some questions about how to market yourself as a wine educator. And on top of all of that, he is a CSW and a speaker and wine educator for the Wine Elite Sommeliers group out of Orange County, California, where I'm sure it's 75 degrees and beautiful. So everybody say hello to Adam. I'm going to tune out. And thank you so much for being with us. We are all looking forward to this. So Miss Jane out, Adam in.
Thank you, Jane. That's a great introduction. I am actually in Phoenix right now. I'm sure it's nice in Orange County, but I think it's even nicer here today. So I am on the road. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. So then let's get started. As Jane mentioned, I have in the past couple of years done a lot of things in wine and marketing and so on, and I do a lot of work with the sommelier company doing events. We're currently here to do a festival to do some panel tastings there, and so I've learned quite a lot in the last few years, and as you may be able to tell by the photo, I have not been drinking wine for a very long time. I started when I was 21 years old to seriously drink wine, and toward the end of being 21 years old, that's about the past 4 years, and I think that I learned quite a bit very quickly. So a lot of the questions that I get from people who come to our seminars are about how to learn about wine quickly. How is it possible that I know enough to help lead seminars at my age? I'm 25 now. Many people have been drinking wine for 30 years and think that there must be some secret to learning a lot about wine. And I know that for several different reasons, there's a good motivation to learn more quickly about wine, to learn more from perhaps less wine purchasing, so get the most out of your wine dollar in terms of education. Some of us want to learn to be instructors, teaching other people about wine. Others just want to learn how to build our collections so that we have something nice to drink in our later years. And so hopefully we'll touch on some important tips for any of the motivations you have for learning about wine. I actually started learning about wine by attending wine tasting sessions among some experienced wine tasters with a meetup group, actually. And that's really my experience. And I think, as Jane mentioned in a question someone asked before the call, what is the best way to learn? I think there is no way of getting around doing quite a bit of tasting, but it's very important how you do the tasting and what you do during that tasting. So that's mostly what we'll talk about today. And so one of the things that I think is important always to talk about first is what not to do, how not to learn about wine. And this picture is the overwhelming image that comes to mind when many novice wine drinkers think about starting to drink wine, or when they're tasked with picking up a wine at the store and making a selection. And this picture makes it seem like the best thing to do, or the only thing to do, would be to sort of plunge in anywhere. And that's really the problem, is plunging in anywhere or not knowing where to plunge in. But after you learn a little bit about wine, and after you've read perhaps the CSW study guide or other books on the subject, or spent some time tasting with experienced people, you'll see that, of course, there are perhaps 10, 15 really important essentials to start with, and we'll talk about the importance of picking essentials. But we don't want to plunge in anywhere. We don't want to simply get recommendations of good producers from friends and family. While that may lead to a lot of enjoyable experiences, you're not likely to learn very much about wine, sort of jumping from recommendation to recommendation. You're also not likely to learn about wine by drinking simply a lot of it over time. As I said, many people have been drinking wine for 30 years. They come to one of our sessions and they say they learn more from that session than they learned in their whole 30 years of drinking wine. So it's not about time spent drinking wine, although that may be a necessary condition. It's also a little bit dangerous to repeat successful experiences. So you buy a wine, you like it. What most consumers do in the face of seeing this outlay of wine, this photo we have here, is they find one they like and then they cling to it like a life raft in the Nile, and they buy it over and over again, perhaps until the vintage changes and maybe they don't like it the next year as much, or maybe the winemaker changes and they don't like it very much after that. But they tend to repeat, and that's really a way to stultify learning about wine, despite perhaps meaning a lot of successful experiences and enjoying it. And then another, I think, important point, and this goes to the wine tasting sessions that I would recommend that you do, has to do with not distorting your palate in any way, not distorting your nose, not distorting your mind. You don't want to use perfumes. You don't want to have heavy, spicy food that knocks over the fine Pinot Noir you're trying to taste. And of course, you don't want to become intoxicated in the case of drinking for the purpose of learning about wine. So those are what not to do. And I think perhaps more interestingly, now we can go on to what to do. So I think the secret to learning about wine really breaks down into a couple of components. The suspicion typically is that a person who knows a lot about wine, particularly at a young age, must have a great nose or a great palate. That's probably the number one question I get. And when I shut that one down by saying, no, I'm just like you, the next question is, well, your parents must have had a lot of wine. You must have grown up around them talking about it. And it couldn't be farther from the case. In my case, I'm originally from the Kansas City area in Missouri, and it's not a big wine market. It's getting there, but my parents, I think, have never purchased a bottle of wine for themselves, and I definitely did not grow up around it. I really only started drinking wine seriously after I moved to California. And it's also not a function strictly of formal training. The third question they usually ask is, well, where did you go to school then? And I tell them it's mostly a process of self-study, self-training, and then of course there are great organizations like the Society of Wine Educators that offer programs to help you learn about it, along with courses and these types of webinars. But a lot of the legwork that you'll do in learning about wine is of course in tasting on your own. And so I think primarily success in learning about wine is based on a couple of factors, or based on 4 factors really, and that is the principles that you use to make your wine selections, the tasting group, or the sort of support group if you were talking perhaps in another context, but the people you surround yourself with in the process of learning about wine, and then the tasting methodologies you use, which support good habits of thought about wine tasting, and that's the 4th component, habits of thought. So I want to talk about the selection criterion first for wine. And this is something that I learned in going to the wine tastings that I started going to when I was 21 years old. And that is that what's very important, and this I learned sort of implicitly because it was something that the person putting together the wine tastings, who actually now owns the company I work with, the sommelier company, did. He picked out wines according to essentials. And by that, what I really mean is that we started with the classics, and then we moved out to other things. And the classics, in this case, of course, means classic grapes and classic regions and classic grape and region combinations. Understanding those things is a way to learn very quickly. Once you understand the 10 most important grapes or the 10 most important wine growing regions and what the wines are like that come from those regions, you really are a long way into your wine education. And I would say that's what we really focused on, and that's what allowed me within a matter of perhaps 6 months to start educating others about wine who were starting from the beginning and who wanted to know the essentials of where to begin. And so it's the classic grape and region combinations. And then, of course, that entails avoiding things that are more exotic. Now, those might be interesting experiences, having a grape that's being grown in a New World region where it's perhaps an experimental thing, and they may be producing something that's very good and very interesting, but the utility of that wine experience may be limited in terms of your ability to learn about wine. And then another thing to think about, I think that's important, is chronology. So which wine regions began when, and how and what have they settled into? There are many regions, of course, in the world that have very rigid traditions now because they've been growing wine for thousands of years, or growing grapes for thousands of years. And then there are other places where, understandably, there's much more variety, much more entrepreneurship, much more innovation happening in terms of where grapes can be grown. And those are things that I think it's actually best for the purposes of education, again, not necessarily for the purposes of enjoyment, but for education to start chronologically where wine began, and then move outward and then see what the various stages of development of the global wine market actually are. And one of the reasons for that is that you can see what are we starting with, what are the essentials to know about wine, why perhaps did these regions settle down with the grapes and with the winemaking styles and with the perhaps the cuisine that are paired with those wines. Those are the things where asking those questions can really profitably give you a good foundational education, and then you can take that knowledge and move outward and start comparing, say, how does, Petit Verdot grown in the United States compare to what we would expect from that in France, where it's a minor component of Bordeaux or something like that. Now, the second criterion for selection then after that and within that is maximize variety. And I want to be a little bit clear of what I mean about that. I'm not necessarily talking about a variety of different wines, because of course you want to start with a small handful. You don't want that giant room full of wine that we looked at before. You want beginners to see maybe 10 or 15 or 20 wines sitting on a table and seeing that these are what await them in the beginning of their journey in learning about wine. And so we want to look for variety not of wines but of attributes. And if you think about it, wines are simply bundles of attributes. So wines have a certain amount of tannin, or they have color, red or white, or they have acidity, or they have a certain level of alcohol, or they have a certain amount of a particular aroma or flavor. And so these attributes are essentially factors which can be organized onto a scale, and you'll see that if you break wines into their attributes and don't think about them as those bundles of attributes, that what we're really dealing with when we try a lot of different wines are simply different measurements of those attributes. And what I recommend for selecting wines to study is that you look for wines that represent as many distinct and distant from one another places on the scale of any particular attribute. So perhaps in one tasting session you want to look at acidity, or perhaps you want to look at tannin, or color. If you were to choose, say, tannin, you might have on one side of the spectrum something like a Pinot Noir or a Gamay, and then on the other side of the spectrum you might have Nebbiolo or Cabernet Sauvignon. And then you want to try to maybe fill in the gaps and create a spectrum where you can look at how the measurements of this one attribute vary across these different wines. And once you've done this with a good number of attributes, and there are only a handful of those really to look at as well, you will have learned a lot about comparative tasting. And comparative tasting, as I'll get to next as a methodology, is, I think, one of the quickest ways to learn about wine as well. And by the way, on the slide, so this is the aroma wheel. This is perhaps a good tool for thinking about what attributes you might want to select wines in accordance with. And if you are looking for resources perhaps ahead of knowing much about wines, because of course if you're learning about wines you may not know which wines have these attributes, I put photos of two very good resources for that down at the bottom. Of course, the Certified Specialist of Wine study guide is extremely useful for learning about the attributes of different grapes and different styles, and the Wine Bible. Karen McNeil has done a very good job in the second edition of the Wine Bible, which came out recently. And I'm still in the process of reading it, but it's a very, very good book, and I did read the previous edition, which is a little bit dated now, but also very good if you can get your hands on it. Okay, so moving on to methodology. And this is the comparative methodology, the methodology point number 1. I think this is the most important. And the reason that we think a lot about methodology is that methodology in tasting, one, represents those selection criteria that we talked about, how we've chosen those wines, goes hand in hand with the methodology we're going to use for tasting them, and then the good methodology in tasting supports good habits of thought, which we'll talk about next. But to really appreciate the variety of wines, the variety of attributes of those wines, you really need to taste them side by side, because what we're trying to do here is eliminate, at least for the purposes of working in a real blind tasting study or a wine tasting study, you want to eliminate your reliance on memory for learning about wines. You don't want to taste a Merlot now and then try to compare it to a Pinot Noir that you had last week. You may be able to do that. You may, of course, over time, hopefully build up a big bank of knowledge and experience, and perhaps even develop your ability to mentally taste and smell wines that you've had in the past. But for the purposes of learning, especially early on, you really want to taste wines side by side. So all of the tastings that we do for the purpose of learning, and especially learning quickly, involve multiple wines tasted side by side and well paired to provide contrast, but also in many cases to provide similarity for learning about these wines and comparing their attributes. And there are two things that may not be obvious, but which I think you'll realize that you kind of sort of already knew intuitively if you think about it after the fact. But you need two wines to detect the difference between different measurements of a particular attribute, but you actually need three wines to find similarity. And this, of course, applies to things beyond wine. This is just the way that consciousness works. We're difference detectors among two things, and then we find similarities when we have two things that have an attribute in the same measurement or similar measurement contrasted against something that has a very different measurement. So we usually serve three wines at a time so that we can go in rounds between the three, looking for the differences between any two of them, and then looking for which two are more similar compared with the third as a foil. And the second important methodology point is to taste blind. And there are reasons for this beyond avoiding bias in, say, a judging competition or something like that. It's actually a cognitive issue that if you are not tasting blind, any knowledge that you have or even expectations that you have about the wine can actually influence what you're doing with your mind at the time and change the nature of what you're perceiving. Maybe not radically, but if you're looking for a particular attribute because you have textbook knowledge, knowing that that attribute is likely to be high in a particular wine, the fact that you are using that selective focus to look for that attribute will in a way amplify it against other things that are in your mental periphery. And so even apart from bias and judging or something like that, we always want to taste blind for the purposes of learning about wine. And for learning about wine, you really want to ignore the rumors, the legends, the expectations. You want to be able to look only at really what appears in the glass and move up from there. So instead of a deductive process, which may be useful once you have a head full of wine knowledge, and if you're in a blind tasting competition, you have a deductive process of eliminating certain wines, what it can't be, what it might be, and then deciding among those. At the time that you're trying to fill your head with that knowledge, the most important thing to do is to taste inductively, to look for those things that you can detect in the process and pay attention to those, excluding in any way that you can any bias or any outside knowledge. And so there are some good tools that you can use in the process of blind tasting. I don't think you should do nothing other than look at the fluid, because a lot of the questions or a lot of the measurements, those categories that we would think in terms of wouldn't occur to a novice taster. It may be useful to use the aroma wheel to ask questions, or it may be useful to have an experienced taster with you, but who understands your context of knowledge and isn't moving past you, and who can help you to look and ask the right questions so that what you get out of the wine is something that's really there. I like to use checklists to go through aromas. If you don't have the aroma wheel, you can say, what are the floral notes? What are the fruit notes? Are there any earth notes? Did they use oak on this wine? How acidic is it? How mouth-watering is it? Is there tannin? Do I feel that friction between my tongue and the roof of the mouth, or around my gums? And then another thing to remember in blind tasting is that if you really don't know what the wine is, you also don't necessarily know how it was intended to be used. And many old world wines, of course, are made to go with food and are thought of as something that's really only complete as a product once it's consumed with food or paired with perhaps classical pairings from the same region. And so some wines you'll want to taste with food, some without. And what I normally do is, of course, always have food that's likely to go at least with the with what I suspect will be the style of the wines, and start out by tasting it without the food. Look at the acidity, look at the intensity, see if it needs food, if it would be improved by, or if it would improve food, and then introduce food to that process, and look at it from both sides, and take notes about all of this, of course. So all of this methodology, this selection, is to support good habits of thought about wine, and the best habit of thought is to pay closer attention. Many people who drink wine for years and years, who have a lot of experience with it, even with very fine wines that they're paying a lot of money for, they don't pay sufficient attention to them when they're drinking them, and therefore don't really see everything that they have to offer, and don't therefore appreciate it and get the value that they could out of it. So learning to pay closer attention, of course, it helps to have people who enjoy tasting wine, who are perhaps trying to learn it as well as you are, so that there's good conversation about it. But paying closer attention, realize that appreciation of wine is a cognitive thing. Many people imagine, because what we're talking about is taste and smell, and how well it goes with food, that primarily we're dealing with something like sensory pleasure, like the pleasure perhaps that comes from, getting a good massage or something like that, that we're dealing with the senses. We're not really dealing with the mind. And I think that is the opposite of the case. I would actually say that perhaps the majority of the pleasure that an experienced wine taster gets out of having wine is actually intellectual, is actually cognitive, is the act of actually dissecting the wine and enjoying it in the moment, looking for all the different things that it has to offer, and building memories and associations, and perhaps thinking about what you were doing when that wine was a bunch of grapes still hanging on the vine. Many intellectual components to really appreciating a wine. And so, of course, for the purposes of learning and also for the purposes of appreciating, you want to ask a lot of questions. You want to interrogate the wine in a certain way and really think about what it's showing you over time. I tell people, don't think about a wine like a photograph, think about it like a movie. Many wine tasting judging competitions and things like that for the purposes of practicality have to be conducted quickly. But I've always told people when I do a wine review, I spend about 2 hours with it, because you don't want to walk into a movie theater and decide if you like the movie after a few seconds, and a wine is much more like a movie than it is like a photograph. Watch what it's doing, pay attention, ask questions about how it's changing, and use that selective focus to think about the attributes that you may already know you're looking for and comparing among the wines. So you want to actively be separating the wines from one another, saying what makes these different, and then perhaps bringing in a third, what makes them similar. That is the essence of all of cognition, really of all of thinking. It's a process of asking questions, and it's a process of detecting differences and then integrating what you're learning, integrating it back into the form of perhaps concepts or sentences, and then larger ideas. And the same is true when you're using the senses of smell and of taste. And once you're becoming a little more experienced in wine, it's very useful to consciously be developing that memory bank, and to compare every experience you have of a wine with the previous experiences of it that you've had. Last night I went to dinner and I had a Chianti Classico Reserva, and I was thinking back through all of the Chianti Classico Reservas that I've had recently and in past years, and also comparing with the nearest similar wines, of course. So similar but different wines themselves, perhaps Brunello di Montalcino, also made with Sangiovese, or perhaps Morellino di Scanzano, or other Tuscan wines that may be similar. And having that memory bank allows you to learn more about the wine that you're looking at in the present moment. So consciously developing that, and the way that you do that is, one, of course, again, paying closer attention at the time. The only reason I'm able to remember the past 10 or 20 Chianti Classico Reservas that I had is because I paid close attention at the time. I took notes. I remember it. I was very careful to make associations with what I'm eating, where I am, who I'm with the conversation, and building those associations is a great aid to memory and is a great aid to learning in the long term. And then the other sort of cognitive habit here is thinking causally. So not just accepting what you're seeing in the wine as sort of a brute fact to be memorized, but you want to embed it into an understanding of the cause of that attribute. So if you see a particular flavor or a particular aroma in a Cabernet Sauvignon that you're having, and you wonder where that comes from, it's actually worth looking up. Why does Cabernet Sauvignon sometimes taste like green bell pepper? And why does it sometimes not taste like green bell pepper but have much more of a fruit profile? These are things that once you started asking the question why, start thinking like a child again, the repetitive why, those are really ways of groping at causality in order to integrate what you're learning into a larger narrative that can be remembered and that can be applied more successfully. So thinking in terms of causality, why might there be tannins here, and why might the tannins make this taste good with a particular food or bad with another food? So it's important to, I think, adopt these habits and adopt these methodologies, and then to get in the right sequence, sort of what I've already said somewhat implicitly, what you're doing here, getting it in the right sequence. But to be explicit, you want to evaluate the wine, you want to look at these attributes inductively, you want to be tasting on your own. I think that tasting really, even if you're doing it with other people, should, at least in the beginning, be a private experience. I think you should even close your eyes and be in a quiet room, and you can spend a lot of time. You need to be alone with your perceptions in the beginning. Write them down, come to some conclusions, come to some evaluations, note any open questions that you have, note the answers to questions that you've already posed, and then take these notes and then bring them into discussion with other people. And those can be other people who are at the same level you are in your wine education, but for me, it was most profitable in those early 6 months of my wine tasting experience to bring those observations, those questions to other people who were more experienced, because what that actually enables them to do is not simply dump more observations onto my lap for me to sort out with these sort of brute facts, but they provide the causality. So I would observe something and then someone would explain, oh yes, that's because X. And forming those causal links are something that it's the last step in your learning. It's the integration after that differentiation, after that analysis. It's the synapsis. And it's something that you don't want to introduce too early into the process, because otherwise you'll simply start memorizing. And you want to have a causal understanding that isn't from memory. So I always recommend coming to your conclusions on your own and then moving on to discussion. And within the concept of discussion, I would of course include things like reading wine magazines, reading wine reviews, reading beyond sort of the basic facts in any of the guides or any of the important books about the wine at the point of making a selection. You don't want to go in with any abstract knowledge that comes from other people's experience before you've really had the chance to form those experiences yourself and then see them verified in the explanations of other people. So just to summarize, I think the most important things to remember from this is that learning about wine is remembering that it is not an overwhelming complexity that you're having to deal with. When you walk into a wine store, there aren't really 10,000 different choices that you need to understand and make. There are perhaps 10 or 15. Those things can be gleaned from a helpful study guide or a book in advance. Then you want to move on to making the right selections according to essentials and according to the maximum variety of different measurements of those attributes as represented here again on the aroma wheel, and also in terms of things like acidity, tannin, and so forth. And then methodologically, in your tastings, you want to be always doing comparative tastings. I recommend 3, again, because you can differentiate and integrate. You can look for differences, and then you can look for similarities. And then, of course, I recommend tasting blind, both in terms of covering up the bottle and tasting something without knowing what it is to really get what you can get out of the fluid before you get any of the information that the label presents to you. But also blind in the sense of starting out only with your own senses, not bringing in observations from other people, and making sure to pay much more attention, take notes, and think causally. And so I think if anyone has any questions that have come up, I will be ready to take those. I think we have perhaps a good amount of time for questions today. Any advice for memorizing wine regions? Yes, I would say, honestly, I think, and this is where I touched on in the beginning, having a good wine tasting group. The reasons for having a good wine tasting group go even beyond the experience of the other tasters or the process of tasting, but also the economics of it. And the economics of splitting a wine perhaps 10 or 12 ways and having 8 or 10 wines at a time means that you'll have much more exposure. And the best way to memorize wine regions is to really taste those wines. I think you can get very far in reading textbooks and reading study guides and learning quite a lot, but what's going to stand in your mind if you approach wine tasting primarily that way are a bunch of proper nouns which stand as sort of floating concepts in your mind that aren't really tied to anything. and that presents a real problem for long-term memory. You may have short-term memory when studying for an exam, or you may have associational memory if perhaps the wine region reminds you of a certain word, or you can create a story as a mnemonic device for remembering the different regions, or tie it in with a historical fact that you know, or something like that. But the real best way to remember these wine regions long term, I think, is to taste the wines and to build up a whole host of associations around those experiences, and to spend a good amount of time with those wines. Meg Hansen compliments the session. Thank you very much. Oh, I missed Tim. Tim, do you have any grocery lists to maximize attributes and variety in attributes? I think so. I think I would really still say to take the top kind of most important grapes in the world and the perhaps most important regions for those grapes. And so look for, of course, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, Grenache in France. In Italy, look for Nebbiolo, Sangiovese, Corvina, at least as it's expressed in Amarone, is a very, I think, important style and very different from those other wines in Italy. I think what you should look for are wines within the category of grape and region combinations that are the most significant, perhaps, which are the most different from one another, and you'll be able to figure that out from looking at any of the books, particularly the Wine Bible or the CSW Guide, which will go through kind of each of those grapes to tell you what they're like. And so Joey asks about the 10 most important classical grape region combinations. I would say, and let's see if I get to 10 here, I think it's important to have Cabernet Sauvignon-based blends from Bordeaux, from the left bank Bordeaux, Merlot or Cabernet Franc-based blends from the right bank in Bordeaux will give you a different impression. I think you should have a Syrah from the northern Rhone Valley, and if you want 100% Syrah for the educational value of that, look for Cornas. That's the village where they are 100% Syrah. In the southern Rhone, we're introducing more of Grenache, so that's often I think it's going to be difficult to find by itself, but you don't really need to find it by itself because blends are very important in the southern Rhone, so that's an important combination to look for. Look for Nebbiolo from Piemonte in Italy, from Barolo or Barbaresco, or from the Langhe. Those are the important places for Nebbiolo. For Sangiovese, look perhaps to Chianti Classico in Tuscany, or Brunello di Montalcino is the other wine that is very important Sangiovese. On the white wine side, of course, not to leave those out. If you're a fan of Chardonnay or trying to learn about it, the best place to start is Burgundy. That's the home of Chardonnay, and white Burgundies are pretty much always Chardonnay. You won't really find anything else. For Sauvignon Blanc, look to the Loire Valley, particularly Sancerre. For Chenin Blanc, look to Vouvray, also up in northwestern France. I would say those are important ones to start with. You might look at Viognier from the northern Rhone Valley as well as an important white wine that's very different from other white wines you might be used to. And then, of course, the white wines of Alsace, Pinot Gris or Gewürztraminer, also very important, I think, on the world stage in terms of quality wines. And I'm sure that I left out important combinations. I do think maybe perhaps allowing 20 or so combinations to be a good place to start, but try not to overwhelm yourself. Perhaps compare 10 of them in the beginning. So someone asked about a wine tasting group in Orange County. I see Joey already answered. You can email him there. Also, if you're in Los Angeles or San Diego, we do a lot of wine tastings there regularly as well. You can join us. Let's see. So Brenda asks, she missed the first part of the presentation. Is there any way to somehow review it? I don't know. I don't believe that it's being recorded by Society of Wine Educators. I am recording it, so if you'd like to write to me, I could send you a copy of it from my side. My email address is there on the slide. And yes, I can send anyone also a copy of the slides if you email me to request those. Do I ever come to Chicago? I do, usually for private events, but I can imagine at some point that we'll have public tastings hosted in any of the major cities. If you email me again, we'll keep in contact with you. We have a good mailing list with some wine insights that we send around about once a month. Wow, we even have attendees on airplanes. Nice. So Tim asks about exemplars with respect to that earlier question about sort of a grocery list. I would say if you want to see an exemplar of tannins, the best place to look is a young Nebbiolo. Those will be perhaps the most tannic experience that's yet still enjoyable. For something like, let's see, acidity, a very good example would be a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I noticed particularly even the 2014s that are out right now are very citric in their flavors, and they have this strong acidity. It's very lemon-like, many of them have been, where normally you might expect grapefruit from a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Those are a great place to look for acid. And of course, the way to detect acid really is mouth watering. So good thing to do is swallow the wine and then tilt your head forward with your mouth closed and then see if the saliva builds in the front of your mouth. You can do it also with fruit or with different exemplars of different categories of things. Like, for example, if you're looking for, let's say, baking spices in a white wine, you might look to a very complex Riesling. A Spätlese often has these kind of complex spice characteristics. If you're looking for notes like licorice, something like that, look again to Nebbiolo. That's perhaps a bit more of an obscure thing to be looking for, something you may be tasting for later. But wines from around the world will come to be associated sometimes with very unique flavors, which will help you in a blind tasting. If you're looking at Shiraz, those also have those, Shiraz or Syrah, same grape, have different tasting notes, but related from different parts of the world. You'll notice in the Barossa Valley, you're much more likely to get honey-baked ham as a meat note, a touch of sweetness, and also perhaps a eucalyptus flavor, whereas from the Northern Rhone, you're much more likely to get something like bacon fat and black pepper, things like that. You'll be able to organize wines after a little while according to the attributes that show up in each of them. But if you get a good guide to all of the grapes, you'll see that there are really only a handful of attributes, and you shouldn't make it overly complicated. There are only a handful of attributes that are really the essence of each of those grapes that you'll see represented in most examples of wines of typicity around the world. And those are the ones you want to hold on to. Steve asks about any good wine groups on the East Coast. I'm not familiar with particular wine tasting groups there. A good place to look, of course, though, is Meetup or Eventbrite. Um, and then another good place would be to go to a good wine store, particularly if you can find wine stores that have aged wines, that have really knowledgeable staff. That's really going to be a hotbed. You'll be able to ask them who in this town puts on wine tastings, who knows about wine, who should I be friends with. Those are good leads. Tony asks, do I associate a touch of sweetness with highly alcoholic ripe fruit grapes? Sometimes I would say that in a red wine, if you have a touch of sweetness and perhaps a more viscous, heavy, full-bodied wine, that does have to do with it being a little more alcoholic. And as a winemaking factor, they can choose to leave just a little bit of residual sweetness in there um, as something to balance out perhaps the bitterness of alcohol. In When I mentioned Shiraz, though, I was more talking about an aroma, and this is actually an interesting topic to separate out the aromas and flavors from taste. So actual sweetness versus something that perhaps smells sweet, that has a smell of honey, or that has a smell of vanilla, or something that if you would taste it normally would taste sweet. So sometimes we have to be careful when we talk about that. But yeah, many wines that have a touch of sweetness, it's just a factor of having residual sugar left in it by the winemaker for the purposes usually of balance um, or a particular style, and that does require a good amount of ripeness, of course, because if the grapes are not well ripened, or if they have a hard time becoming ripe, it's very difficult to have a wine that has a touch of sweetness left after the process of fermentation, where most of the sugar is consumed by the yeast. Exactly. Christina says cinnamon is a good example of something that's not sweet but smells sweet. And I would say too, in Riesling, if you get a dry Riesling on the bottle, it will say Trocken, or even a GG, Grosses Gewächs. It's the great growth, so kind of the Grand Cru level of Riesling. Those tend to be dry, bone dry, but they have somewhat sweet aromas because an important note in Riesling is, of course, honey, and often those baking spices like clove or cinnamon, and sometimes other things that are sweet like orange. Janelle raises a good point. Many people experience ethanol as sweet. So ethanol, the alcohol in wine, often smells sweet and then tastes bitter. That's what it does for me, at least anyway, which is an interesting thing because you have to think about that differently when you're pairing food. Christina asks about my favorite wine with shrimp scampi. I'm actually not a fan of shrimp, but I would suggest perhaps a if you're going on the white wine side, you have many options, but perhaps something from the Loire Valley would be nice. Something with a little bit of something with acidity, and also perhaps some grassiness and citric flavors, but also maybe some sea spray if you get it from France. Riesling could work as well, would probably need to be dry though. I saw above somebody asked about availability at the event I'm actually going to be at today. It's called the Crush Brew Festival um, in in Phoenix, Arizona. It's actually in Scottsdale, I think. So they have a website. I'm sure you'll be able to see if they still have tickets or if they sell them at the door. I'm not sure. So, question of planning a tasting soon. 4 wines. Can you recommend 2 reds and 2 whites? I can. I think that's actually a really good way to start thinking about it. Coming up with the smallest meaningful differentiations that you can make in a tasting, and then perhaps building out from there. So, what are the two of the most essential um, wines on the red side, and 2 of the most essential on the white side? I would say that, again, starting with the old world for purposes of learning, I would say perhaps start with a Cabernet Sauvignon, arguably one of the more important uh, grapes in the world, from the left bank and Bordeaux. And then for contrast with that, and also for um, another highly important wine, look for a Pinot Noir, of course, from Burgundy, in the other side of France. On the white side, arguably, perhaps the most important white wine is Chardonnay. That from Burgundy would be a great place to start. And then if we were sticking with France in the beginning, because that really is a good place to stick with learning the classics, I would say go to Sancerre for Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire Valley. But the the Riesling fanatic in me suggests going to the Mosel, and getting a nice Spätlese Riesling to try, in contrast to that, because it perhaps will show you a little bit more of a difference from Chardonnay, from the attributes of Chardonnay, than Sauvignon Blanc does. Christina asks if I'm planning on studying for the CWE. Yes, I am. So I haven't committed to a timeline on that, but I am interested in doing that. So I have a question for all of you. Does anyone have any tips for accelerating your learning about wine that you don't think I covered? Because I think that would be perhaps a great thing to close with. Janelle says travel. I agree with that. And travel may also be a good answer to the question of how to remember the wine regions better. Because when you've associated your experiences of those wines with all of the other things that are going on that trip, you'll never forget it. I know that a wine that many people aren't familiar with, but which I love, Bandol, It was for me much easier to taste in a blind tasting, and also much more interesting and more enjoyable after visiting the region. Talk to winemakers more than wine sellers. Yes, and particularly when you get to the stage of thinking causally and talking to people about why things are the way they are in wine. Sometimes if you go in too early and talk to a winemaker, you'll be bowled over with all kinds of facts that you have no way of integrating into your knowledge, and um, and they're so steeped in all of the causal understanding of how things work that they may not appreciate your context if you're coming in as a beginner. But it's definitely a good way to get those causal questions answered. Review new learning within 24 hours and test yourself. That's a good idea. Try to perhaps bridge the gap between short-term and long-term memory. Christina says visualization, visualizing yourself there in those wine regions in vivid detail. Sarah says acronyms to remember the wine regions. There are some things in wine that are worth knowing, that are worth memorizing. Um, if you perhaps need to know all of the Cru Beaujolais or something like that, there are reasons you would want to know that um, before you would have the opportunity to go to all of those places and try to distinguish the wines from one another. Tim says flashcards are very effective, but you have to use them correctly. Reading them um, fast every day, shuffled. I think reading them aloud too would be useful, because if you can remember the sounds, the rhythm, kind of the music of what you're saying. Sometimes that's another arm on the memory that you're developing. Tim published a paper on this. Okay. How important is it to know French when discussing French wines? Well, I would say you have to be able to learn the the terms associated with wine, but they're not so many that you would have to learn the whole language to really understand what's going on in reading a wine bottle. I would love to learn French, and I've several times undertaken the process to start doing it, but it's a big endeavor. So I studied German for about 10 years, and that's as far as I've gotten. But learning enough French to be able to appreciate everything that's on the label, I think, is important. And perhaps some winemaking terms if you really want to get into understanding what's going on. Many winemaking terms are in French. Okay, it looks like we are right at an hour. So I will stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions that they would like answered. But otherwise, I'd just like to say thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the seminar. And again, feel free to email me at adam@sommeliercompany.com if you have any questions or if you'd like me to send you anything that I've mentioned here.